I'd like to offer each of you a warm welcome and introduce myself. Um, my name is Karen Milborn, and it is my honor to serve as the new J. Sanford Miller Family Director of the Fralin Museum of Art here at UVA. And I am thrilled to be able to stand in front of all of you on this gorgeous Sunday afternoon and that you all came. I'm also absolutely delighted that this event sold out not once, not twice, but 3 times. So that is just a teaser as to what you are in for. It's my honor today to introduce Prudence Peiffer, who will give our Gladys S. Blizzard Lecture in partnership with the 2024 Virginia Festival of the Book. Before we start the afternoon's program, I'd also like to acknowledge that the building we are in today, UVA School of Architecture and the Fralin Museum of Art, both sit on the territory and homelands of the Monacan Nation. We also acknowledge that much of this city's and this university's economic and cultural growth is beholden to the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants. So please take a moment to be aware of your space and also to silence your cell phones and look around and take note of the exits. This afternoon, we are delighted to present this event as a collaboration between the Fralin Museum of Art, its volunteer board, the Virginia Festival of the Virginia Festival of the Book. Many of the members of the Fralin's volunteer board are joining us today, and we are especially grateful to Jane Davis. Oh, there you are. Okay. So everyone give Jane a round of applause because this absolutely could not have happened without her creativity and vision. And she leads the Fralin's book discussion group. Thanks to her vision and her relationship with Prudence, this event came to life over the past 6 months. The Virginia Festival of the Book is a program of the Virginia Humanities, a statewide organization whose mission is to connect people and ideas to explore the human experience. After our lecture here, we invite you to walk over to the Fralin and join us for a reception where you will have the opportunity to see artworks from the Fralin's collection that directly relate to Prudence Peiffer's book. And I have to tell you already, I've sneak peeked. It's gorgeous. It's worth it. These works were put on display especially for this event and will only be on view through the end of today. We also have a bookseller on site during the reception, and we encourage you to meet our author by getting your copy of the slip signed. We'd like to give a special thanks to our sponsors, the Blizzard family, the Fralin Museum of Art Volunteer Board, and Tom and Jane Davis. Because of their support, we are able to offer this exciting event. We'd also like to thank the Virginia Festival of the Book's premier sponsor, Michelle and David Baldacci. You'll notice you have received handouts provided by our own volunteer extraordinaire, Jane Davis. Along with this, you'll see surveys for the Virginia Festival of the Book that we invite you to fill out after the lecture. You will also see a ticket number on your packet. After the Q&A, we will draw 4 tickets to announce 4 winners of a free signed copy of Prue's book, The Slip, to be claimed at reception. As a disclaimer, please also remember that festival authors and speakers represent themselves, and they do not represent Virginia Humanities or the University of Virginia. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Prudence Peiffer is the Director of Content at MoMA in New York City. As an art historian, she specializes in modern and contemporary art. She earned her PhD at Harvard University, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University, before going on to become the senior editor at Art Forum magazine. Prue has published in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Art Forum, and Book Forum. Her book, The Slip, The New York City Street That Changed American Art Forever, was published in 2023 and has received many accolades. Among them, The Slip was longlisted for the National Book Award and shortlisted for the Apollo Book of the Year Award. The Slip is a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and it appeared in Vanity Fair's Favorite Books of the Year list. We are delighted to partner with the Virginia Festival of the Book to present what is sure to be a fascinating peek inside one enclave of the American modern art scene in New York. Everyone, please join me in giving a resounding welcome for Prudence Peiffer.
So I'm going to kick things off by setting the scene a little bit about the place that I will be talking about, Coenties Slip, since it's such a central part of this book. And I know this is actually a very well-informed audience for anyone who is a part of Jane's reading group. So hopefully this talk won't be boring to you after all of the work that you've already done in thinking about the slip. But if you haven't read the book yet, or even if you have read the book before you had started reading it, I am curious, how many of you had heard of Coenties Slip? Okay. Or knew where it was in New York City? Or that New York City had things called slips? Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why I really wanted to write this book. I mean, one of the fascinating aspects is, particularly in some book talks I've given in New York City, even how many people have come up to me afterwards and said, I've lived in the city my whole life. I've never heard of this place. I never knew it existed. I never knew about its history, let alone that Robert Indiana, Ellsworth Kelly, Agnes Martin, James Rosenquist, Delphine Seyrig, Lenore Tawney, and Jack Youngerman all lived there together for this period of time and made so many artworks that were related to that place in kind of material and historical ways. So this was really one of the main reasons why I wanted to be able to tell this story. So what is a slip? In nautical terms, a slip is a ramp or water space between piers for landing or repairing boats. It's a mooring, a safe harbor, but it's not a permanent home. And this definition serves as a kind of metaphor that runs throughout the book. The artists living on Coenties Slip were there for less than a decade, and some for just a few years, but their time there meant everything. And here you see, this is an early map of the city's southeastern edge. It's kind of turned counterclockwise. And Coenties Slip is right there in the middle. Starting in the first quarter of the century, a dozen slips ran up the southeastern edge of Manhattan. They are among the first and most crucial engineering projects of the settlement. Coenties Slip is bounded to the northwest by Pearl, the oldest street in Manhattan, and led out like a widening funnel or bell to the East River, passing Water Street, Front Street, and South Street along the way. And these street titles tell the story of creeping coastline development, as each used to be at the river's edge. So the name Coenties Slip, it most certainly comes, or almost certainly comes, from early Dutch colonial settlers, Conrad and Annette ten Eyck. The area of the slip where they lived became known as Coenties, a contraction of Conrad and Annette. And I really like this idea that the woman's name was a part of the place, which for that period of time is a kind of unusual parody as well. Willem de Kooning told Jack Youngerman that it should be pronounced Coenties, but Coenties has stuck with us and perhaps allows a little more for that contraction of the two names. So here we're looking at another map from 1849, and right here over on the left, you can see Coenties Slip as one of the deepest slips, slicing all the way to the boundary of Front Street, whereas the surrounding slips and piers go only as far as South Street. So it was truly a waterway and also only a few blocks long. And then in the late 19th century, and you can see here in this map, the waterway portion of the slip has been filled in. And this is in part because drunk people kept falling into it at night, and it's made into a little park. So we're right here. And you can also just see the curving ladder line of the elevated train, which started running in 1875, 30 feet up, snaking its way through Coenties Slip. The L train took a famous turn through the slip, where for a moment it looked like you might run into the sea before it veered right again. And the L stopped running in 1942, but its steel armature wasn't fully dismantled until the following decade. And not surprisingly, considering this turn, there were a lot of crashes. And one thing you also learn when you're doing research on a very particular place is that one of the things you really discover about that place is everything that's in police blotters, because that is really one of the main ways that a place gets registered into the historical record. So you can see the L referenced in Stuart Davis's amazing House and Street from 1931, a painting at the Whitney in New York, which depicts the intersection of Front Street and Coenties Slip. The slip in Davis's painting is a series of lower brick warehouses. Bright blue triangles against a green column suggest the elevated train tracks. Taller buildings, even then rising behind the 19th century buildings, are made from patterned lines, stripes, and grids, not unlike samples of work to come at the slip by Ellsworth Kelly, Agnes Martin, and Lenore Tawney. And here's a Google Map aerial view of Coenties Slip today. So again, just to set the scene of this place, the persistence of travel, of arrivals by sea, by land, and yes, by air. You can see with the helipad there coming off of Pier 6 right in front of Coenties Slip. And in fact, that helicopter pad opened in 1960 during the time that artists were there. And Robert Indiana often comments on the noise of helicopters coming and going in his journal. Coenties Slip was once the center of trade for the growing metropolis, a place where the sheer volume of goods loaded and unloaded from ships and warehouses was staggering. One journalist walking down the slip in 1879 recorded streets clogged with wagons and horses hauling bales of cotton, hogshead of tobacco, barrels of flour, sugar, loads of oranges, boxes of tea, 4 bushel bags of peanuts, cases of silk and Indian shawls, a steam boiler, and coops of geese. Coenties Slip was not just a row of sailmaking lofts. Every building had multiple trades stacked by floor, a snapshot of burgeoning American capitalism and speculation. On the ground level were grocers, dry goods merchants, earthenware dealers, saloons, weighers, measurers, hiring halls, ship stores, and chandlery. And on the upper floors, iron dealers, towboat proprietors, accounting and clerks, and warehouses. And here is a photograph of the slip on a slushy winter day in 1893 by none other than Alfred Stieglitz. The broad prows of the great ships cut over the street like a canopy of branches to the street lamp, which itself resembles a mast. The sidewalk below signs for sail lofts and sailmakers and paint shops is crowded with men, and South Street is clogged with horses and carriages and a lone man shoveling dirty snow. So this is when South Street is known as Street of Ships and the neighborhood of Coenties Slip as Sailor Town, where on any given day, 2,000 sailors embarked from ships berthed in the slips. But by the time the artists arrived at the slip, it was already a place of waning industry and relative obscurity, described in many accounts at the time, and really multiple accounts, as a desolate desert after 5 p.m. and on the weekends. Here, captured on the roof of one of the buildings on the slip by the great photographer Hans Nemeth in 1958, are some of the central characters of our story. The French actress Delphine Seyrig, perched on the wreck of Adirondack chairs, her toddler son Duncan Youngerman next to Robert Indiana, who was then still known as Robert Clark. Just behind him, the artist Ellsworth Kelly, then Jack Youngerman, the artist married to Seyrig, and Agnes Martin, always in sensible shoes. And not to be forgotten is Orange, Seyrig and Youngerman's dog, or L'Orange, as Seyrig playfully called her, found on the street and an important connecting force between the artists and others in the neighborhood. And not pictured, but a part of this core group, Lenore Tawney, shown here in her Coenties Slip studio and riding in her big Daimler in downtown New York City, and James Rosenquist, standing outside of his Coenties Slip building and in the productive mess of his studio. Less than a decade earlier, Hans Nemeth had helped launch the mythic reception of abstract expressionism, photographing and filming Jackson Pollock's balletic paint flinging at Pollock and Lee Krasner's studio home on the East End of Long Island. Now he was photographing the group at Coenties Slip for the next chapter of American art. But if you were to stumble on Nemeth's Ruth photo without knowing about this short-lived community in New York in the 50s and 60s, you might be surprised to see such different artists together in a single image. Each would go on to have a crucial impact, whether seismic or subtle, on 20th century art, even if their work was often difficult to fit into any one movement and its reach not always equal. These artists never formed a group or a movement or a school, and they worked in very different media: abstract and representative painting, drawing and sculpture and assemblage and textile works, theater and film. This setting fostered what I call collective solitude, a model of creativity that's about being together in a very specific place at a very specific time without denaturing each individual locked away story. To focus on place is to write a different history of art, one that can be perhaps more inclusive, more open to serendipitous interaction, and can explain more of the cultural, emotional, and financial context behind any art object. To bring in those small details around the conditions and materials of working that help uncover why anything even ever gets made at all. Their time at the Slip helped them find themselves as artists and provided literal material for their work, salvaged from the wreckage of all the demolition going on around them, as the last vestiges of an older moment in the city made way for skyscrapers. And though they swapped materials and spaces and stopped doing one thing or started doing another because of what they saw in each other's lofts, though they became lovers and broke up, they could retreat to the solitary work and discipline of art making without any need for explanation or excuse. For a brief moment, the Slip was home for artists who had been at sea. This ragtag group of artists, all starting out in their careers, despite ranging in age from 24 to 50, they all end up in these cheap, illegal maritime buildings and former sailmaking lofts on one of the most obscure streets in New York City. And I'm showing you here a very tongue-in-cheek, quote, outlandish guide for in-tourists that ran in Esquire magazine in 1960, where Coenties Slip is listed as one of the 10 most in places to live because it is so obscure. And, you constantly do have this tension because, just to point out, this is a place where Harry Houdini left from to perform one of his most famous underwater escape stunts in 1912, and where the author Anais Nin visited Lenore Tawney's studio salon evenings to hear musicians play and marvel at Tawney's fiber arts. But the reality was that, quote, there's a kind of end-of-the-world feeling about Coenties Slip, as Youngerman said, speaking about how the artists living there had little desire to go back into the city. This idea of going back to the city, despite the fact that Coenties Slip was very much in Manhattan, suggests just how separate a realm the neighborhood represented for the artists. One of the things we were very conscious of, as Youngerman put it, was the fact that we all knew that we weren't part of the de Kooning Pollock legacy in art, which was centered around 10th Street. Even in the late 1950s, Ab-X and its second generation were still the reigning idea. For Youngerman, this was the first time that American art had made an impact beyond the local, and this colored the air. For these artists, Coenties Slip was completely apart from the New York art scene. Since it was dug and shaped, Coenties Slip was always a place apart. That's the story of its geography and history. At the threshold of land and sea, it harbored a unique microcosm of labor, perpetually home to hybrid communities that were deeply anchored to it and also transient. In other words, these artists were far from the first. One of the most distinct of these communities was the New York City canal boaters. And here's a Harper's Weekly illustration from 1884 of the canal boat colony on Coenties Slip. The canalers and their families lived on their boats most months of the year, traveling more than 500 miles from Buffalo to New York with cargo of wheat. The Slip became the center of flour trade in New York, and the community at the end of it was known as Canal Boat Village. But they were also constantly facing threats of eviction through the closing of waterways and shutting down of mooring rights at the Slip. And articles always pointed out the separateness of the canaler. Here's one quote from the New York Times. "No city man, nor country man, nor yet a follower of wind and current, but a being unto himself. He is as special as a merman." Or the other contingent community of the Slip, sailors, who found harbor on shore leave a place to stay and an escape from creditor sharks at the Seaman's Church Institute, established in 1913 at the end of the Slip, a hotel that slept just under 600 men, but also served as a place to get a hot meal, take a hot shower, and receive mail. And it's also a place where the artists at the Slip went for a hot shower and hot meals. Another contingent form of labor was the acting life of Delphine Seyrig. For Seyrig, much of her time on the Slip involved waiting. In letters home to Paris and Beirut, she describes the difficulties of balancing life as an actor and a young mother, the countless auditions she went on, the short runs of off-Broadway shows in Connecticut or Boston. It felt liberating to be alone in a hotel room, prepping to become someone else on stage. She was grateful for the acting life in which such a separation from her regular routine, the suspension before returning to the world, had a time limit. Seyrig realized that part of her talent was that she could easily slip into another life and then out of it again. And her story is truly amazing. I don't have time to get into it here, but 2 film projects related to the slip were among the most anomalous projects made by people living there. She ended up starring in Robert Frank and Alfred Leslie's Pull My Daisy. You see a still from that film on the left, what became the kind of quintessential cult beat classic, narrated by Jack Kerouac and with Allen Ginsberg and other poets starring in it. And after the French director Alain Resnais visited her in her loft on the slip, she ended up leaving New York to return to France and star in Resnais' Last Year in Marienbad in 1961, which launched her as an international film star. There are other stories of labor. Jack Youngerman and Robert Indiana, short-lived teaching endeavor, the Coenties Slip workshop. And here you see the front cover of the brochure they designed for it. This was a very ambitious brochure. It quoted Herman Melville's Moby Dick, drawing on a history of the slip that was a very rich literary history as well, with Melville, Whitman, and Hart Crane being important lodestars for these artists. On the opening page of Moby Dick, Melville famously cites the slip as a stop along one Sunday stroll through the metropolis, so that even in the city, our fate is to dream of the sea. And incidentally, the film adaptation of Melville's Moby Dick, starring Gregory Peck, premiered in New York on July 4th, 1956, so it really was in the air. The idea for this workshop was to earn some cash, inviting amateur artists to take art classes at the slip. But after just a few months, it limped to a close. There were several logistical reasons for this. It was too out of the way, and the space was too cold. While the artists dealt as best they could with their own drafty lofts in the winter, often collecting old wooden pallets from the Fulton Fish Market to burn in their stoves, somewhat aromatic, as the artist Ann Wilson put it, it was too much for the workshop attendees. But in many ways, the workshop was set up to fail because the artists' hearts were never in it. The slip was their private place, a refuge from the very city the workshop invited in. As Agnes Martin put it, when you paint, you don't have time to get involved with people. And that's what's so wonderful about the slip. We all respect each other's need to work. For Martin, the slip offered a particular geographic isolation that was really necessary for her to work, away from interruptions, as an artist who suffered from schizophrenia and strove for what she called, quote, the perfection that transcends what you see. And here she is in her quilted work suit, practical again, considering the lack of heating in the slip lofts. And it was really at the loft that she got to work. I just painted and threw them away and painted and threw them away. And one of the first works that she made and liked at the slip and didn't throw away was Harbor No. 1, 1957, which you see here on the right. And it was significant to her because it symbolized, quote, a safe place. It's also important to point out that while in the early half of the 20th century, women enjoyed a brief stint of liberation, encouraged by gaining the right to vote, the rise of industrial jobs that required their skills, and the exodus of so many younger men from the workforce during World War II, by the 1950s, it was considered highly unusual for a woman to live alone and inappropriate outside of separate hotels and buildings designated women only. In a period in New York that also saw the harshest crackdown on homosexuality and a retrenched stigma against living alone, unmarried, after decades of progress, the slip was something else entirely, a safe harbor for its predominantly gay artists. The slip also provided literal material for the artists, much of it related to its deep maritime history and the intense demolition going on around New York City, particularly downtown, during this period. And the research nerd in me was so excited to find this receipt on the left in the Ellsworth Kelly archives. I always, when I'm doing research, say I want to see everything, even the receipts. And this is kind of a reason why, because here you see in one of his last months at the slip that he brought yards of canvas from a marine hardware and sailmaker company on Chambers Street, bringing his supplies back to paint on in a loft where once such canvas was used to sew sails. And on the right, you see one page of Kelly's sketchbook journals from his time at Coenties Slip, where he writes of all the noise from the river, heavy rainstorms when he had to go up to sweep the roof, but his ceiling still kept leaking. These pragmatic notes written amid wonderful sketches of paintings he's working on whose forms and shapes were taken from encounters with his environment. And here on the left is one of my favorite photos from my research of Kelly up on the roof of Coenties Slip in 1957. One of the first things that he did when he moved to the slip was start a small flower and vegetable garden on the roof, complete with corn. And it's at the slip where he really took up his daily practice of plant drawings, begun earlier in Paris. His studio would soon be filled with his elegant sketches of plants. And though audiences today are very aware of this incredible part of his oeuvre, it wasn't so well known at the time. The first drawings weren't exhibited in New York until 1969. So these plant drawings were really best known among his friends. They breathed oxygen into his paintings, too. It's not just that nature provided subjects for Kelly that were already made, or that his drawings allowed him to think through forms in a way that instructed all of his paintings. He saw nature itself as the ultimate artist. "I want to work like nature works," Kelly said, as if channeling the poet John Keats. "I want to paint in a way that trees grow, leaves come out, how things happen." Another less-known aspect of Kelly's practice are the postcard collages he made, beginning at the slip, and then throughout his career. And here on the left, you see this is just a standard postcard that was issued by the Siemens Church Institute. And here on the right, Kelly has taken that postcard and made a collage, playfully confounding the view's scale with his fruit. And again, since the Siemens Church Institute was a source of food for the artists, there's a kind of nod to that. And Kelly makes a kind of proto-pop intervention into the scene. Lenore Tawney would hang her woven forms from the tall rafters of her former sailmaking loft or onto the hoists, and she would finish the ends of her work with sailor knots, as just outside her window, tugboats with the same knots drifted by. Here on the right is one of her journals from her time at the slip. She made several drawings of the view from the Staten Island ferry looking back to the Manhattan skyline. You can see birds swooping through the churn of the ferry's wake that seems to tumble down from the cityscape in dark, tangled lines, not unlike the cascading currents of her woven forms. And this is her work Vespers from 1961, which Tawney is working on in her loft. She used water metaphors to describe her working method. In one ecstatic weaving session, she wrote that her work poured out like a fountain or a river. The river was right out my window, and I looked at it every day. And during this period, she and Martin both made major works titled Dark River. Robert Indiana was among the most resourceful, tearing down loft walls made from cheap homosote particle board to use as the structure of the work, as in his The Slips from 1959-60, hauling found pieces of wood and old wheels, gear shifts, and stencils from the demolition of maritime and industry buildings back to his loft to create assemblages and sculptures. Here in the middle, we see his marine works from 1962, made from a 19th century loading ramp he found at the slip, and named after the ship chandlery shop that used to be his studio. And in this photo from his Coenties Slip studio, you can see him sitting amid some of his treasures salvaged from the buildings on the slip. Ultimately, it would be the incorporation of words and text into his paintings and sculptures that was the biggest breakthrough for Indiana. And that has everything to do with his time on Coenties Slip. The incorporation of text was inspired in part by his brief affair with Ellsworth Kelly, who became an important catalyst for Indiana's art, as well as with the environment of the slip itself and the building that Indiana lived in. He used to joke that he lived in an Indiana. He said that with Ellsworth, my whole life perspective changed. I could feel that something was going to happen shortly, and it was just like going through a revolving door from night into day. And here you see a work by Indiana in the Freyland's collection, which we can all see in person right after this talk. The period that the artists were on the slip was a period of experimentation, of failure, of mistakes and false starts, just as much as it was one of breakthroughs and some of the most beloved and crucial works of American art. On the left are a series of 6 columns that Indiana created in 1963-64 at the slip, and you can see on the bottom they read Coenties Slip, New York City. These works were made with salvaged masts from ships, and on the right is one of the anomalous sculptures that Agnes Martin made for a brief period on the slip. This is called Burning Tree from 1961, and you can also see it's made from found and reused maritime wood and material. And here you can see that same sculpture in her studio on the slip that year. It's thanks to Lenore Tawney that any of these early 3-dimensional works by Martin even exist, as she destroyed as Martin destroyed most of them, but Tawney was able to save some of them by purchasing them, acquiring them, in order to give Martin some money to live. Supplies were precious, so paintings that didn't work out were quickly painted over. Here's a page from Indiana's journal on the left where he's writing about an early work he made that was more abstract, called Agadir, which ultimately he felt was too close to his neighbors Agnes Martin and Ellsworth Kelly's approaches. And you can see how he ends up reworking it to become The American Dream 1, 1961, a painting that left Alfred Barrs spellbound, and he immediately purchased it for a moment's collection, which was a huge moment for Indiana, who at the time didn't even have a gallery. And just to say, Indiana's excitement about this work entering MoMA's collection was really palpable. Every artist has to fill out a kind of acquisition form when a work comes into MoMA's collection. And reading the form that Indiana wrote, he does not play it cool. He's bubbling over with explaining what this work is about, and it goes on for pages. And actually, when Barr finally got a chance to meet Indiana, he told Indiana, "Your questionnaire is as much a masterpiece as your painting." Indiana's painting is about missteps in the American dream. He called it cynical, coming out of his childhood in the Depression when life was so mean, and his father, who left his family to travel to California on Route 66, was full of dreams and promises for the big house on the hill, which never materialized, and Indiana, in fact, moved almost 20 times during his childhood. For his own take on the American dream, Indiana includes signs of transience, passing through, gambling, and luck, highways, pinball machines, and roadside bars. The jukebox America he painted in the American dream could be as much about the dream of openly going out and dancing in a bar in New York as it is about a kind of Midwestern status quo.
And here is James Rosenquist, president-elect, which he began working on in the late fall 1960 at Coenties Slip, painting on the back of thin masonite panels that he'd recycled from his job as a billboard painter. They barely fit into his studio, scraping the tin ceiling. Rosenquist painted the smiling head of the politician John F. Kennedy, just elected, about to be sworn in as the first president born in the 20th century and the youngest in history, offering the U.S. a new frontier stretching all the way to the moon. Kennedy's face, bigger than a door and with teeth the size of toasters, seems to be taped with paint strokes to an image of manicured hands breaking apart a layered slice of moist cake and the side of a gleaming auto in the far right panel. Quote, "Every ad in every magazine and TV commercial is telling you that you could buy happiness on the installment plan." As he was working, Rosenquist placed the panel with Kennedy's face in the window of his slip loft so that anyone looking up might see an incoming president smiling blankly out in the middle of a row of warehouse lofts on the edge of the river. The critic Gene Swenson, who was already making a name for himself as an important interlocutor for what would come to be known as American pop art, was at a loss for words when he first saw Rosenquist's painting. He stayed at the Slip for several hours despite the cold. He remembered Rosenquist jumping up and down as he talked, perhaps less out of animation than to keep himself warm. Swenson worried that the tall artist might hit the low ceiling, a worry exacerbated by the scale of the painting, so that, quote, "At any minute I expected either the roof slowly to begin rising or the walls to move in storybook fashion." Rosenquist offered him a swig of rot gut rum, but Swenson tried to keep warm instead by taking copious notes. He left the visit bewildered and quite upset, in his own words. "The paintings temporarily defeated me, my training, and my aesthetic philosophy." Just a week before the assassination of President Kennedy, Rosenquist left Coenties Slip for Broome Street. In his new studio, right after Kennedy's death, Rosenquist pulled out his painting from a few years earlier that he had ostensibly finished at the Slip. We now know, thanks to the detective work of art historian Michael Lobel, that he significantly reworked President-elect. The main area of his focus was Kennedy's face, which he repainted, perhaps remembering a day down at the Slip in 1960 when he saw the presidential candidate drive by in a convertible, a strange cinematic overlap with his later death scene.
So, spoiler alert, for those of you who haven't read the book, part of the brevity of the artist's own time on Coenties Slip was because it was literally being brought down around them as the older, lower profile of the city made way for new glass skyscrapers that were emblematic of the new identity of downtown as a financial center. And there was a great irony that the architect of so much of this change, Robert Moses, who you see here on the left, was also the city official that, through his role as president of the 1964 World's Fair, also helped bring many of the artists on the slip to their broadest audience, displayed on the exterior of the New York Pavilion. The artist's short decade on the slip is bracketed by a history of battling for preservation legislation in the state, with the Bard Act in 1955, which argued for the importance of place, not just structure, as a trait to preserve, and then the Landmarks Law in 1965, approved just a few years too late to make a difference for the slip. A few years after the community of the slip was disbanded because its buildings were razed, the artist-in-residence zoning amendments made it possible for artists to live legally in commercial loft buildings in Soho and Tribeca. Part of the story of what slips away is that vernacular, modest history of a city block, what Jane Jacobs wrote about in her incredible The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961, as a necessity to preserve the vitality of a city block by saving old buildings, which allow for a diversity of industry and aesthetic styles through, quote, the ingenious adaptations of old quarters to new uses. Jacobs' book came out after more than half the buildings on the slip had already been razed. And soon after, Ada Louise Huxtable published a series of books on the architectural potpourri, her term, of Manhattan under threat. And she literally walks down Coenties Slip to describe the importance of preserving not just the big civic monuments, but, quote, these modest groups of minor buildings that create the essence of a period and the spirit of the city. And here on the right, you see a demolition worker sitting on one of the great gargoyles that used to skirt the roof of the Siemens Church Institute, which was torn down in 1968. So here I'm just going to end with some fun images of kind of everyday life on the slip. Here you see on the left Youngerman, Kelly, and Martin on the roof of 35 Coenties Slip with the East River behind them. And along with Robert Indiana, Delphine Seyrig, and toddler Duncan Youngerman, the group having lunch in Kelly's loft. And here is Agnes Martin and Ellsworth Kelly in Kelly's loft. And I just have to point out the amazing trapeze swing you see here. There are some great anecdotes of mishaps from visiting guests who climbed aboard. Martin and Kelly were eating breakfast one morning when Kelly folded the lid of a round coffee can, cut it, and set it back on the table where it gently moved, evoking a rocking horse. Martin suggested that he should make that, and it became his first freestanding work, Pony. Another idle sketch that Kelly made at Martin's table on an envelope addressed to her became the formal basis of a sculpture gate. These moments with Martin in their morning ritual were, for Kelly, quote, unconscious breakthroughs. Here we have another swing, this one occupied by Duncan Youngerman, as Jack Youngerman works in his Coenties Slip studio on some studies for larger paintings, studies he called seeds about to break open into the potentialities of shape. And on the right is a painting by Youngerman, Ram, 1959, made on the slip. This work was a departure for Youngerman, taking up some of the central colors of a small canvas that Ellsworth Kelly had just made on the slip for Robert Indiana, and which Indiana kept in his personal collection until his death. MoMA curator Dorothy Miller, on Kelly's urging, came to visit Youngerman's studio in September 1959. This was a momentous visit, especially considering the out-of-the-way place and the rickety ladder that led to the top floor space where Youngerman worked. Miller, of course, was in heels. Her visit alone was, quote, an act of generosity, as Youngerman put it. Miller took Ram back to MoMA, and 8 days later let Youngerman know that he was invited to exhibit 6 paintings in her upcoming exhibition, 16 Americans. As Youngerman joked, I was the last person chosen. I was the 16th American. Kelly was also in the show. And decades later, Kelly ended up buying Ram when it came up at auction in 1999. 40 years after Kelly and Youngerman had exhibited together at MoMA in a show that was so central to both of their own careers, Kelly donated the painting to MoMA. And Youngerman saw this as a hugely generous gift, a gesture to memorialize that crucial early time and place in both of their lives.
There's a lot of stories like that at the slip. What are the bounds of a specific place, and how does its history get into the work made there? Can certain places offer a unique kind of refuge to create, experiment, mess up, supported by people around you, but also always independent? I wanted to write an art history that acknowledges the parts of a place picked up and reworked, the ways that its own unique material history gets into the work in literal and less visible ways. And Coenties Slip was such a unique locus, a place and displacement at the same time, something cut away and filled in by another material. The compression of focusing on a very short period and just 3 blocks of New York City actually brings us out into longer bands of history. Place quietly gives us a way to tell an art history that mentions how artists protected each other's space to work and spied on each other's progress, how they paid their electrical bills and illegally tapped into gas meters, how they scavenged materials for their artwork, how a column of wood taken from a demolished building and turned into a sculpture was itself once the mast of a ship. What they did when they were having a bad day, or the equivalent of writer's block, the escape of taking the ferry or walking over the Brooklyn Bridge. A history that didn't presuppose that artworks grew out of other artworks alone, or come fully formed into the world for us to experience them. For me, the story of this particular group of artists is a kind of modest generosity that's rarely noted in history's steady march of disruptive geniuses. Ann Wilson, one of the artists who lived briefly on the Slip, was inspired by how her fellow artists there, quote, created a gestalt about the total commitment to the work and the life there. Call it commitment, call it love. Thank you.
So you're all now invited to ask questions, and we can bring the mic out to you. If you just raise your hand.
So the question is, what was the most surprising fact or idea that I discovered in researching and writing the book? I think even just getting into the project itself, and the book was kind of born out of my surprise to discover all these artists were together at this time, and that I had kind of been trained for a quarter of a century in art history and had never really learned about that. Coenties Slip was always this kind of footnote. And if it was mentioned at all, it was mentioned kind of very specifically to one particular artist and not kind of thinking about all of them together. And then I think, the surprises just kind of kept rolling from there. I had no idea that, in the first years, or hundreds of years of the colony and the settling of Manhattan, that how central that street was, that it was one of the earliest streets in Manhattan, and that it really was a center of trade, and that it was, this place that was just, really at the core of the city. Because, of course, by the time that the artists that, I was studying are there, it's almost become famous for being so obscure and out of the way. So that's all the history of the other people who lived on the Slip, and even the Siemens Church Institute. That was all such a revelation to me. And totally awesome as someone who, as an art historian, it's really fun to get totally out of your wheelhouse and be, reading all these crazy 19th century sailing books and, really just getting into archives that I was not expecting to get into. And then, I think the other kind of surprise for me is, when I started working on this book, I knew there was a kind of beautiful story about the artists and the artwork, but I had no idea that there would be this whole other side of kind of the architectural history of New York as well. And I did not think Robert Moses was going to play, any role in the book, let alone kind of be this really interesting, pivotal character who, on the one hand, gave these artists this incredible exposure at the World's Fair. So Indiana Kelly and Rosenquist are 3 of the 10 artists chosen to be on the New York Pavilion. So this kind of major, moment where hundreds of millions of people are going to see it. But then also was, literally working to pull down their neighborhood at the same time through his various development projects throughout Manhattan, but particularly focused on downtown Manhattan. So that was a kind of real surprise for me. And I will say one of the first book events I did for the slip was out on the East End of Long Island, East Hampton Authors Night, and Robert Caro was there, the of course famous author of The Power Broker, and it was really kind of an amazing thing to get a chance to meet him and say, "You're cited in my book." So.
Can you describe Coenties Slip today? And are there any efforts to preserve what the area contributed to art?
So I have, since I've been a little busy, but I have not yet looked into, someone else actually asked a similar question about how can you get a landmark status. There's one building left, 35 Coenties Slip, where Kelly, Rosenquist, Martin, and Wilson lived, is still standing. All the rest of the buildings have been, torn down. It is now, an apartment building, very different than when the time that the artists were there, but it is still extant. And it would be amazing to get a landmark plaque on that. It is very different, but that's sort of a part of the story too, right? Is that there is constant change, and one of the one talk I was giving, someone mentioned that they know Coenties Slip because as a skateboarder, they used to go there in the 80s when the Vietnam War Memorial, which has this kind of like almost like a half dome, cement, was added to kind of the end right by the river and FDR Drive. And that was a place, because not a lot of people were there, where another kind of itinerant community, skateboarders, they would go and skateboard. And I kind of loved that there was this continuing life of that street for different kinds of pursuits. But it is a very different place now. Besides that one building, downtown New York in general is very different. There's a CBD dispensary, which Rosenquist would have appreciated. I don't know, but no, it feels very, very different. But you do still have a little bit of the kind of cobbled streets, and if you've been downtown recently, you still kind of get that sense of the city's grid kind of falling apart and things being a lot more narrow and close. And then you kind of turn a corner and you suddenly see the river. And it's also interesting, because, at the time of the 50s and 60s, a lot of these lower profile buildings were being torn down because of the commercial possibilities of airspace of doing much bigger skyscrapers and, Chase Bank, and the financial industry was really kind of moving in there. But actually, ironically, just even a few months ago, it was announced that many of the buildings that were then built are being turned back from commercial buildings into residential buildings because of the kind of surfeit of commercial office space in the city. So, it is this constant story of churn and change, and which is of course, New York itself. But it is, you can still go down there, and there's a little street sign that says Coenties Slip and the one brick building standing. So.
It's a great question. It's a question about how I got all these images. Money. Well, sadly, yes, for actually publishing the book. But it's sort of a combination of, so there was many of the artists' foundations were incredibly generous with images and ephemera. The kind of core of the book story, and one of the moments when I kind of knew that I had a book was I started interviewing Jack Youngerman when he was 90, actually, in 2017. And what I thought would be like a couple of interviews just turned into like a 3-year monthly friendship. He was just such an extraordinary artist and kind of philosopher and thinker. And he was so modest about, his life. He just knew all these kind of very famous people, and it was just so generous with his time. And he, and then introduced me to his son, Duncan Youngerman, who now is the keeper of also his mother, Delphine Seyrig's papers. And so he, there were a lot of the snapshots Youngerman took. And so that was a kind of wonderful revelation. And then it's just kind of like looking through archives and, bringing things together. And in terms of the artworks, I mean, that was another, to get back to your question about what surprised me, you don't know much about Coenties Slip, but then you suddenly realize, oh, Bernice Abbott was down there taking pictures at Coenties Slip. Stuart Davis was doing a painting. Alfred Stieglitz was photographing it. So there is actually a really rich history of artists in that space. Franz Klein used to walk down there, and found it to be a real inspiration. So it's really, it's interesting to start to trace as you bring things together. And there were many more images that I wished I could have used in the book, but just for space and economics, it was not. I was able to, add a few more for these kind of lectures, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I have two questions. The first one, I just wanted to know how you came across the topic and realized there was so much material there, because it does seem so surprising that this rich history is now being told. And the second, well, I can wait if you want the second question, but the second question I'll ask, just go for it, is I was really struck about the purchasing of objects, of artworks directly by MoMA during this period, especially when galleries were still so important for new artists in New York. Curious about how, if the history of the place, now knowing all of this, how that changes our perspective sort of on these artworks being put into the institution that seem almost imposing, when you walk in MoMA, and the use of the materials as subversive, like the mats from a sailing ship, but now knowing what we do about where it comes from in the community, sort of how, if that changes your view on how we see them in the institution.
Yeah, those are two great questions. So how I came upon this topic, well, I think, I'd reviewed a really great biography of Agnes Martin by Nancy Princenthal, and there's a chapter in there that talks about her time on Coenties Slip, and it's great, but I really wanted to know more. It left me with sort of more questions, and it was obviously very much from the perspective of Martin. And then when I was working at Art Forum, Ellsworth Kelly had just died, and we were writing to people to kind of pull together a major tribute for the issue. And one of the people we reached out to was Robert Indiana, who sadly himself was already very sick, and he submitted the photograph of himself and Kelly and Agnes Martin on bikes, downtown on Wall Street. And I just remember thinking, hold on, like, wait, what? They were all together, and I didn't know that Kelly and Indiana had a relationship. And so that kind of just started to, make me think, oh, this is really, there's an interesting story here. And then, as I said, sort of talking with Jack Youngerman, trying to start to do research, kind of in parallel, talking to people who are still alive who had been there, and then also starting to kind of just try to do research about, really early, like 17th, 18th century Manhattan and what was going on, and realizing that there was this incredible, rich material history there that, hadn't been kind of brought together before. So that's kind of where that came from. And then, it's an interesting story because, again, despite the fact that in many ways this was an out of the way place and it was obscure, et cetera, and the artists really needed that to be experimenting and doing this work and allowing themselves the space to kind of fail. But it also was, a lot of the art world was a lot smaller then. And so even though it was this obscure place, a lot of people came through Coenties Slip, and that, was really, so Alfred Barr was there, and, Dorothy Miller is a really extraordinary, I hope someone writes a biography of her, because she's such an incredible figure in 20th century art. And she, you do get the sense that New York was sort of small enough at the time that she really kind of saw everything. So she really was directly going there, and Ivan Karp is there. And so there really are a lot of people coming through, but it's also, artists are, it is the support of artists. So it's artists telling other artists to go see things. And it's when someone is going to visit, Kelly saying, hey, you should also check out, right next door, XYZ. But I do think, for me, a lot of the artwork that I had known just outside of this history, but that was made at the Slip at this time, has taken on a very different feeling now that I know some of the background of it, including, something like the Agnes Martin Harbor piece. Just knowing all of the works that basically were destroyed before she felt, okay about this painting. And then the fact that, it's called Harbor. So it has this very direct resonance to where it was painted in a studio where she could look out and see, as she, famously says, the faces of sailors on the boats going by. But also that in again, this MoMA questionnaire that she fills out for that piece, that she writes about, it being a safe place. And that also really, to me, it's just a moving comment. And when I look at that painting, I just think, I have a very different relationship to how I see it, kind of knowing that background.
Do you have any projects in the works? Your next project?
Well, my husband's not here, so I can say no. At the launch for this book in August, that someone asked that question, I could see him kind of get a little bit like, because he has been very patient and such a huge support over this very long journey of working on this book. I am in the very early stages of yes, but I'm not sure yet if it's a book. So I'm still doing some hunting and gathering, but I hope so. So the question is about if there's any space possible today like this in New York, sort of warehouse space, or, a water view loft for the equivalent of $35 a month? Nope. But
yeah, it's a great question. And I think, it's interesting when you
kind of look at some of the surveys of who identifies as an artist and where they live in the New York area. It's definitely pushed out to farther out in the 5 boroughs. I think sort of, Manhattan as a kind of centralized place for where artists live is not the same at all in terms of a kind of heat map. I think as, I don't know, I need to be an eternal optimist. So I don't, and I didn't want this book to feel nostalgic at all, really, that this, especially, as a child of the 80s, I feel like, I've grown up with people always saying, oh, New York was so much cooler just before you were born. Everything was amazing, it was all, and so that's like a frustrating thing. So, of course, this was a very extraordinary moment. And I do think some of the kind of both geographic and historical and economic aspects of what brought these artists together, was really extraordinary and unique and isn't able to happen again. But I do think it is possible. I think that artists, the capital A, sort of the abstract term, but are nothing if not, incredibly creative about finding a space to make things happen. And I'll just say, I have a friend who is an artist, and she runs a gallery out of a shipping container on a future site of a skyscraper in downtown Brooklyn. And so it's like, again, it's this acknowledgement of this is an itinerant space. It's this tiny space. It's like by appointment only, but it's just this wonderful, it's like literally about finding this space in between development to make things happen. And also, interestingly, T Magazine just ran a piece a few weeks ago about, how there are some artist-run or artist buildings that people are still kind of hanging on in the city. And, some of them were in Brooklyn and farther out, but one of them was actually on Fulton Street. So really right around the corner from where Coenties Slip was. So, I do think, and again, as I mentioned, in terms of the kind of irony of some of these buildings that, the Slip buildings were knocked down for these big office buildings. Now the office buildings are being turned back into residential buildings. And, but there's a lot of kind of real estate potential. And, sometimes developers are now giving artists some of the space in their buildings as tax write-offs and as part of, just to use the space and have the space. So the optimist in me says that it is still possible, but I think it is a very, very different moment for sure than 1956. Should we go to
So in invisible college studies in science, specific place doesn't matter much unless it's a physical activity like laboratory science. Otherwise, it's simply connection. Could be letters, could be whatever. What strikes me about this is because they were in exactly the same place, between intellectual influence of each other and emotional influence of each other, being around other people privileges emotion more than anything else. Does that increased emotionality show up in the work that they produced in any way that you can discern?
Yeah, I love also that you're sort of talking about maybe a more abstract, like intellectual and emotional influence of place as much as the kind of actual materials being used and referenced to place. And I think it really does, not least of all in terms of how I think Lenore Tawney and Agnes Martin, for instance, are, I think, a really interesting example to look at, because even as sometimes it pissed Agnes Martin off to have her paintings be compared to textiles in terms of the kind of lines and threads, but her work is really being read as, seen as having this resonance as the textiles. And then Lenore Tawney, who's working in textiles, her work is being seen as paintings and sculpture. So there's this kind of really interesting way in which the media all get confounded. And I think part of that is the kind of very deep osmosis that's going on between artists at the time there. And even, it's like they both do a work called Dark River, and they're both kind of talking about how that has influenced each other, and just the way that they're thinking about structure. And there's lots of sort of examples of that, and sometimes also productive swerves, I guess I would say, where Agnes Martin is working on a bunch of her more abstract orb paintings, and Indiana independently started doing those as well. And then he goes to see her work and says, like, those are incredible. Mine are never going to be quite like that. And then so he takes his orbs and starts painting words on them and, transforming them into the kind of quintessential Indiana moments. But there's also in the book, one painting that I think very much gets at this emotional aspect is this sort of blue and orange painting that Ellsworth Kelly made, very small painting for Robert, Indiana. And on the back of it, it says for Robert, Indiana, it's on Pier 6. And it was an orange peel that, they were out on the pier together, ate it together. And then as with so many of Kelly's abstract paintings, it's based on the kind of shape of the peel. But you don't need to know that to appreciate the, the painting as just a really beautiful abstract work. But at the time that he made that painting, they were lovers, and he gave it to Indiana, and Indiana kept it in his collection until he died. So, it's also just, there's all these kind of amazing stories of commitment and love in a certain sense, even, as we might look at that painting and just say, oh, that's a beautiful Ellsworth Kelly abstract painting that, and not need to know the reference at all to understand that but I think it brings something more to it and the fact that Indiana kept it his entire life too, which is and you see that with a bunch of other works as well.
I think we'll make this our last question.
So, there have been a few exhibitions before my book. There, at the Manil in 2017, there was an exhibition. I should say that was also a kind of wonderful inspiration for wanting to do more work. And before that, in 1993, actually at Pace Gallery, Mildred Glimcher did a really important exhibition in that, because she also interviewed a lot of the artists who were still alive, and so that some of those interviews were incredibly important for this book. And then actually going even farther back, in the 60s, and then there was also a little exhibition in the 70s at the Whitney, and then in the 60s, Fred Mitchell, who's one of the artists who didn't live on the Slip, but he's the one who kind of brought Kelly there, and he had a workshop on the Slip for a while. Really interesting sort of artist, and he put together a little show exhibition in an antique store. But so I'm very flattered and touched that the Fralin has put together these works, and I'm so excited to go see the pop-up exhibition. I haven't seen it yet, and there will be. Of course, I'm biased, but I think there's it could be a really beautiful and big exhibition, and there's so many incredible maps and other kind of the long history of the Slip, not just looking at kind of the modern art aspect of it. But there will be a small collection gallery show at MoMA opening in October that I'm helping curate with a colleague of mine there who's a curator in the Drawings and Prints collection. And it's really, so it's a part of the collection galleries, and it's really drawing on the fact that MoMA did play a really, essential role and did collect some of the major works from the artists on the Slip. So I think we're borrowing one. Well, the checklist is not finished yet, but we have one sort of amazing film that Marriott Charlton, the filmmaker, made of Lenore Tawney working in her loft, which was never released. Kind of a sad story, and we'll be showing an excerpt of that. But otherwise, the work is all going to be from MoMA's collection, and some of it's been on view, but a lot of it has been in storage. So I'm very excited too, just because it's been a chance to actually see a lot of these works that I couldn't see, especially because of the pandemic and everything. So, yeah. But that's a great segue, I think, for going upstairs to actually see some work and have a drink.
Well, before that, we would like to thank you for your extraordinary kindness in coming today.
So now, everybody,
we do have a reception, so there's the chance to see the pop-up exhibition in the print study gallery upstairs, and we'll have a reception with Prue at the Fralin. So go back up the stairs and across into the museum.